Hi, everyone. I'm just giving people a moment to get in the room. We've got a great crowd coming in today. So thanks for coming. Okay, I'll let the others make their way in, but I know we've tried to put an enormous agenda in today, so I will start on time. Welcome, everyone. For those I haven't met before, I'm Anne Single. I'm the CEO of Patient Voice Initiative, and today I'm filling in for our president, Jessica Bean. Many of you may know Jessica Bean. We're giving her a day off today, although I have a feeling she's going to join us in the background today because she's a terrific champion of this organisation. It's very close to her heart, these topics we're talking about. Before I get underway today, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Yagara and Turrbal land, so I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to pay my respects to any elders who are joining us online today. So the aim of these two sessions, these two online workshops, is really just to raise awareness about this particular kind of research, which we've called patient-based evidence. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute and describe it a bit more fully. And I want to be clear that it's not about making sure that you can go out there and do this research yourself, although some of you may well have the skills to do that or resources. And it may be that you team up with researchers to do it, or it may just help you understand some of the information and research that you see. So, one thing about the Australian patient communities is we know you're a really diverse bunch. And so it's about hearing this information and helping us to help you make sense in a way that's useful for your organisation and your community. So I just want to be really clear. The expectation at the end of this is that you don't have to go out there and do it yourself. I know your patient organisations, you have a lot on your plate anyway, but we hope that these sessions will be really helpful to you. I want to draw attention to the fact that we're recording the session today. And what we will do is we will publish the recordings of these sessions on YouTube, but we've very specifically kept these sessions to only patient organisations. And the reason for that is we understand that when we do sessions in this way, we tend to have a bit of a different conversation, and it can be a very useful difference that we have. But what that means is if you put your questions in the chat, these won't be seen in the recording. But if you come on camera to speak and you don't want to be in the recording, you can just put a note in the chat and we will edit you out. And you can come back if there's something that you're concerned about being in the recording. Please come back to us quite quickly because we do tend to move quite quickly. But if you can highlight it in the chat, and if you want to follow up with an email, and we will confirm to you that we have seen that and we are acting on it. So if you haven't received a confirmation email from us, please come back and check that we saw it. So we want to be really careful about that. So you put it in the chat, don't publish that. You will get an email confirming that we've seen that. So we hope that gives you an environment where you feel relaxed about raising the things you want to raise. The final thing I want to say in welcome is, with my printer for some reason printing behind me, apologies, is we don't assume everyone knows what health technology assessment is. So for today, I just want to give you 3 pointers on it. So the first thing about health technology assessment is it's the process that sits behind how government decides what it will reimburse on the PBS list for pharmaceuticals or on Medicare and under some other funding programs. So that's the key thing about it. The second thing is it's a process that tries to determine value for money. So is it worth the government spending money on this health technology or medicine, or is it better to stay with what they have? And if so, how much should they spend? So they look at clinical evidence and they look at cost effectiveness as well. And the third point about health technology assessment I want to raise is that it's comparative. That is, that say they're looking at putting a new medicine on the PBS so that it's subsidized and more affordable for you, they will compare it to an existing medicine that's available for your community. So it's called comparative. So those are the three things I want to raise about health technology assessment. But the one that's really critical is health technology. It's such a confusing and misleading term, I think. Really, health technologies are anything that can help diagnose, prevent, or treat a condition. So it could be a blood test, it could be a medicine, could be an exercise program, it could be a bandage. Health technology doesn't have to be something with lots of gadgets and computers behind it. It's any health intervention, diagnosis, prevention, or treatment. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Cathy Sertori, who has done a fantastic job taking this training, which was originally delivered in person in Canberra in February, and turning it into something that we can share online. So welcome, Cathy, and thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Well, I'm really thrilled to have such a great attendance today and be part of this really important topic, patient-based evidence. And for those that don't know me, I've spent the best part of the last 25 years within the pharmaceutical industry, but with a real focus on lifting and ensuring we have patient engagement and the patient voice. So it's an absolute privilege for me to be your MC today. So timekeeper, ensuring your questions are heard. It's an action-packed agenda, so I might just, to centre everyone, share the agenda for you here. So we're going to have a plenary session on how patient evidence is different to participation and why it's important. And then we're going to hear a little bit about qualitative insights and their significance, and also hear from the experience of Clare from the Mito Foundation. And then we're going to have a conversation again with Anne, leading the charge with Sarah from Dementia Australia. And then we're going to talk a bit more about patient preferences with Simon and Brent, which will be absolutely wonderful. And then we will wrap up. Excellent. So to kick off the session, oh, stop the share there. So to kick off our plenary session today, I'm going to hand back to the CEO of Patient Voice Initiative. And I think Anne was a little bit modest in her introduction of herself. So she is also the HTAI, so we just talked about the Health Technology Assessment International Vice President, and she's also the HTAI Patient and Citizen Involvement Interest Group outgoing chair consultant. So that's a lot of titles to say Anne is passionate about patient engagement and the patient voice being heard, particularly in HTAI. So now, Anne, I will hand to you to share your slides in plenary. And if everyone has questions during Anne's presentation, please pop them in the chat. We would love to hear it. We're wanting it to be interactive, and there will be an opportunity after Anne has presented for us to ask her questions directly. Thanks.
Thanks, Cathy. And I'll just share those now. I'm hoping now that you can see them. And if you can, you'll actually be able to see that this session is not just Patient Voice Initiative, but it's Patient Voice and CaPPRe. And you'll be hearing from some of the CaPPRe researchers shortly, but Patient Voice Initiative and CaPPRe go back to the start. And we're really thrilled to partner with CaPPRe on these sessions. So we called this workshops patient-based evidence. And that's probably as meaningful as throwing up the word health technology assessment in front of you. And what I wanted to flag was this thing that we're calling patient-based evidence. You might have met under some other terms, like patient experience data. We hear a lot more about that now, especially from North America. And I think technology developers are really embracing that term. In Australia, if you've been looking at the HTA review report or talking to people involved with the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee or the Medical Services Advisory Committee, you meet the words consumer evidence. And, oh, I went the wrong way because there's one more. No, it doesn't work. Oh, here it is. And sometimes you hear all of this under the terms research into patient aspects. I don't think any of that really switches the light on what this actually means. So when we talk about patient-based evidence, we're really talking about thinking beyond what is captured in clinical trial data, clinical evidence, to understand a broader picture of patients or consumers or carers or family members' needs, preferences, experiences, and perspectives. And that word perspectives is really important to this research. If we think about traditional research, it tends to be constructed from the viewpoint of someone who's a researcher or perhaps someone working in a health professional space. So what does that mean? It means that we ask different questions about health technologies when we have a different perspective. And so when you're a patient, you have particular questions you might ask when you hear a new medicine might be available for you, or your doctor might suggest a new medicine, and you'll have your questions. A clinician has different questions, again, that they might ask when finding out about the medicine. And someone developing those medicines might ask different questions again, and some of them overlap. So we all might want to know about some common points around outcomes, and we all might have some common questions about side effects. But because patients had put medicine into or a treatment into the context of their whole life, they often have much broader questions. And these questions are often not answered in other forms of research. And so that's why this area of patient-based evidence has existed. And it's existed for a very long time. But as I say, it's existed under a number of different names. So this very crowded slide is just to give you an idea of the sorts of questions that are beyond clinical benefit and risk that often get asked in a health technology assessment environment. I've deliberately pulled ones from a range of sources overseas, but within our own environment, a range of questions get asked. But I thought these were actually just some interesting ones to quickly show you on a screen. So down there in the corner, you can see a little tiny diagram. And this one comes from some work that's quite old that sits behind Danish health technology assessment, and it influences health technology assessment like ours here in Australia. Everyone influences each other in these spaces. So in their handbook of health technology assessment, they identified that there are a wide variety of aspects that weren't included in the usual evidence from like clinical benefit and risk. So they talked about the social aspects, the communicative aspects, the economic aspects for patients, the individual aspects, and ethical aspects. And you can see there on table 1, this comes from the European UNETA HTA core model. And these are the key questions they ask that are around what they see as patient perspectives in each health technology assessment. So they ask about the experiences of living with the condition. You'll see if you go onto the consultation hub for PBAC or MSAC here in Australia, they ask similar questions. They ask about people's expectations and wishes regarding new technologies. They ask people who've had experience of the new technology, what their perceptions are. They ask about the burden for carers. That could be the burden around living with a condition or treatment for a condition. And they ask about who in the patient community isn't getting access to treatments currently or might have trouble accessing these treatments, and what might be barriers to that access. And they also ask about treatment choices. Why do people choose one treatment and not another? Or why do some people choose not to have treatment? So you can see that health technology assessments, yes, they're interested in benefit and risk and value for money, But health technology assessments always want to put that into the environment where patients live. And so they want to understand, what does this mean? What are the consequences of using this technology or not using it, or using it in a particular way? What are the consequences for patients and their family? And this is where this research that today we're calling patient-based evidence can be really useful. So how is this research different from participation? The first thing I want to say is that most of us have more experience with participating in these processes, you know, perhaps writing a written submission or taking part in a meeting when the health technology assessment is occurring. And the key thing I want to say there is that participation and research both have value. The idea of research is not to displace or replace participation. The idea is to complement it. And one of the things we often see, because we haven't got a lot of research around, you know, from patient-based evidence, there perhaps is more than people think, but because we're not so used to using it, we often use participation when actually research might serve us better. So to think about what the differences are, if we think about research, we know that it comes from robust scientific methods. And over these two sessions, we'll be talking about some of those methods. Whereas participation is the act of taking part, and that can happen before, during, or after an HTA process. And it doesn't actually have to even be limited to just happening within the HTA process. Some of you might have been involved in the recent work around the co-design of the HTA patient involvement processes. And so that's a form of participation as well. With research, its quality can be appraised or critically assessed or peer reviewed. But with participation, we rely on the authenticity and diversity of the people taking part to determine its quality. With participation, we get insights from organisations like yours as well as individuals. With research, we can draw on a wide variety of published research, or we might do what they call primary research and undertake research specifically to answer a particular question. Research has that ability to answer a variety of health policy questions. Participation is often stronger on the local context because it can be more dynamic. So someone in a health technology assessment could have a question that occurs during the process. They might ask a patient organisation, and a patient organisation can bring a perspective on that. Research is less dynamic than that. The other thing about research is it can be very clear about its limitations and bias. And that means that people can critically assess it. They can understand the strengths and weaknesses of it. And research can use a wide variety of approaches. As I said, we're going to find out some more about those over these two sessions. It could be qualitative evidence, including synthesis of studies. It could be preference studies. It could be the development of patient-reported outcome measures. So that's just to give you an idea of the two different approaches. And I just really want to stress that point again. We are not encouraging one to displace the other. Together they can be really meaningful. Because if you can imagine, if you're participating in HTA and there is some really strong research as well, your role can help interpret that research for the local setting and build on it for the local setting. And that can be really powerful. And we'll hear from some patient organisations later who've been connected with that research. Finally, I just want to put forward 3 reasons why we think considering research such as patient-based evidence research is valuable. The first is burden. I'm not sure why I have to tell you about burden. You know the burden of running patient organisations and all the need that there is for patient organisations. But for those of you who haven't been involved in providing input or getting involved in a health technology assessment before, it can be a huge process, and it can be mentally and physically demanding, because it may be the case that there's a treatment that your community really wants to have available. And as a patient organisation, you will pick up the role of providing input. But it's more than that, because you will probably feel a sense of responsibility around ensuring your community gets access for that. And you may also find that a lot of the questions that come up in health technology assessment, you don't really have much to answer it with. Additionally, if you haven't been involved before, or if you've only been involved a little, there's a lot to learn about the health technology assessment process itself. And then you have to communicate that to your community. And so this can be a really hard time for patient communities. So there's a real burden around participation. And so one of the hopes is, by building patient-based evidence, it can ease some of that burden. Because rather than feeling you have to address all the gaps in the evidence base, you can actually take a bigger role in interpreting the evidence and communicating with your patient organisations. The next point is diversity. Some of us come from patient organisations that have a great deal of diversity, but we also know that there's many people in Australia who live with conditions who don't join patient groups. And we often struggle to hear from them in these assessment processes. Researchers can target a particular community and work with you to gain evidence about needs, preferences, and perspectives and experiences from that community, so that people who could never participate by writing a written comment or attending a meeting, their voices still can be heard in the assessment. And the final point is evidence-based. I've watched for about 20 years as around the world people have contributed comments and input into health technology assessment processes. And while it helps the committees learn about those communities, nothing beyond us taking account of it in the individual assessments actually happens with that input. I think it should, and that's a discussion for another day, and we've got ideas about how that could happen. But when you develop evidence like patient-based evidence, that becomes evidence that can be built on continually. So the knowledge that's gained in that can keep being built on. It can be used by others, and you potentially can use it in multiple circumstances, not just in health technology assessment. So that's just a really brief introduction to the subject. I just really wanted to lay out why it's different from participation, how broad the field is, and why it might have value to you. And I'd be really interested to know, just by a show of hands in the show of hands feature, how many people have had experience in one way or another with patient-based evidence before? Perhaps you've used it for a submission, perhaps you've partnered with researchers to do it, perhaps you've led doing it for your organisation. Oh, that's great. That's a good percentage of the call there. Oh, they're still going up.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, terrific. With that, I'm happy to take any questions. You could put them in the chat. Is that the right way to do it, Cathy?
Yes, you can either come off mute now and feel free to ask Anne a question, or pop them in the chat, whatever suits you. And I might kickstart a question off from my perspective. I think it was really good the way that you've defined participation versus the research evidence? Because I do think sometimes that they are used interchangeably. And the question I was going to ask you, but you actually sort of talked to it, which was clear to me. When is best to use research versus being participation? And from what one of the examples that you used was, for instance, an HTA specific submission, someone might participate because they're an expert in that area. So therefore, their experience is really important from a participation perspective. But sometimes it also might be important to have research evidence that is more broad, that can be used as that qualitative, more specific evidence. Is that right? Or is there anything that you'd like to
Yeah,
add to that?
yeah, and you can sort of use it anywhere in the process, the evidence. In our process in Australia, the way I'm just going to talk about the PBAC, Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, who are the HTA body for decisions, for recommendations about what medicines are subsidized. So, for example, with that process, a company will submit evidence about medicine, it'll be evaluated, and then it will go to an appraisal process. And that's often where your consumer comments, that's a very simplified version of it, but that's where consumer comments come in. And so you could submit the evidence to that part of the process as well. But you also could have it that a company might submit evidence about these issues with their evidence they put in for evaluation. So it can go in any way. In some countries, it's been used actually to inform the economic evaluations. So to think about what domains are really important. And one of the things I just would raise about it is one of the reasons we made this distinction, and when I talk about this, I should reference the work of Karen Facey, who really did a lot to help define this area of patient involvement. And I also want to stress that I just failed to mention Sophie Werkӧ and Sophie Staniszewska, who are the people who gave us the term patient-based evidence. So apologies for not mentioning them straight up front. But they did this work and we worked with them on this term patient involvement because we realized that there was confusion within HTA bodies about the difference between something that could be critically assessed and something that should be seen as expert opinion, as clinicians' expert opinion is taken account of too. And so we wanted them to be careful not to conflate the two. And we do think it still becomes an issue that people don't realize, okay, well, this research is really robust. It's qualitative, but it's really robust. And this is expert opinion, which is really helpful for us interpreting and identifying gaps and so forth. So that's why we split them.
Fantastic. That's wonderful. Petrina, you've got your hand up. So I just wanted to go to you, unless that was still from noting that you have been involved in patient-based evidence before, but I'll just pause and see if you'd like to ask Anne a question or comment. No, I think Petrina might have left it up there. And similarly for Karen, I just wanted to make sure we haven't missed anybody. Karen, your hand is up. Did you want to ask a question?
No, I just had taken my hand down. Thanks, Cathy.
Perfect. Hello. Thank you. Well, wonderful. If there's no further questions, we'll continue with our agenda. And I did mean to mention also that there is a break on the hour. So for people who need to grab a cup of tea and have a little rest, we will make sure we're allowing time for that break. So our next session is looking at qualitative insight. So it's my delight to introduce you to a couple of speakers. Our first one is Jenni Godsell, who leads community engagement insights at CaPPRe. In her role there, Jenni draws on over 15 years' experience in qualitative research in Australia, overseas, and including numerous multi-country studies. She conducts in-depth interviews with patients, physicians, and consumers to gain a holistic understanding of participant perspectives regarding the impact of living with a medical condition and to inform the design of the discrete choice experiments. So Jenni's also got a postgraduate diploma in science in psychology from the University of Sydney. And I'd also like to introduce who's speaking in this session as well, who Jenni will hand to, is Clare Stuart. So Clare is the Policy and Advocacy Manager at the Mito Foundation. She's passionate about reducing inequity by improving health, disability and social supports for Australians living with rare conditions. Clare's current focus is mitochondrial disease, and she's also worked in areas relating to dementia, aged health, mental health, and tuberous sclerosis. And Clare has experience across a variety of roles in corporate, not-for-profit, and government, including project management, strategy, policy, and service delivery. So we're delighted to welcome these esteemed speakers for the next session. So I will hand firstly to Jenni.
Thank you, Cathy. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully I can do this okay. Sorry. I don't think that that's sorry, everyone.
No, your screen doesn't like us, does it?
No, it doesn't, but I'm going to give it one more go.
Okay, because I was going to say, otherwise, if you make it as big as possible, I know it's great content, so great content trumps good slides.
Oh, I don't know why that's not working.
Do you like me to share mine? Or
yeah,
just
maybe.
Make it bigger like
actually,
there you go.
is that
You
working?
Yep.
Oh,
Yep.
I'm
Perfect.
excited. I was very nervous about sharing my screen. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you, Cathy, for the introduction. As Cathy mentioned, I work at a research organisation called CaPPRe, and we focus on obtaining information about lived experiences among people who have been diagnosed with various conditions. And today I'm going to be talking about qualitative research because I conduct a lot of qualitative research at CaPPRe, and I'd like to take you through how qualitative insights may help generate patient-based evidence. So I thought that I would just start by giving you an overview of what qualitative research is, how we use it, and what are some of the outcomes of qualitative research. So Cathy also mentioned that I will be having a chat with Clare from the Mito Foundation, and basically that's an organisation that supports patients and their families who are living with mitochondrial disease. So if I just begin by explaining a little bit about qualitative research. So it focuses on understanding human experiences. So it gathers information on perceptions, emotions, and behaviors. It increases our understanding of why people think, feel, and react the way they do. And it also provides the opportunity for people to convey their own experiences. I find a lot when I conduct qualitative interviews and focus groups, people actually enjoy talking about what they've been through. They commonly tell me that they don't really like to burden their family and their friends too much about how they're feeling and the impact the condition has on them. So it's sometimes quite a cathartic experience for people to talk to me about all the things they've gone through in living with their condition. So qualitative research is used for a range of fields. It's used in social sciences, academia, commercial purposes, and as Anne mentioned, for HTA. And there's a lot of approaches within quals. So in social sciences, for example, there's a lot of emphasis placed on observation, where interviewers or researchers will record what's seen, heard, encountered. They take a lot of field notes. Some researchers even immerse themselves in the natural setting or context of the research, which is called ethnography. However, for healthcare research, we find that the best approaches, are in-depth interviews, focus groups and mini groups, and also cognitive interviews. So a little bit of a background on in-depth interviews. They tend to be 60 minutes in duration. We conduct a lot of these over Zoom these days, but they really allow that detailed discussions with participants about their individual experiences. So going right from the start, even before they were diagnosed, the events leading to the diagnosis, up to the current stage where they're currently at. So we can understand their experiences, their thoughts, their feelings. Also looking at experiences with treatment, both current and in the past, and perceptions of new treatment potentially in the pipeline. So focus groups and mini groups. In a focus group, we tend to have about 6 to 8 participants, and in a mini group, about 3 or 4. And they're really useful when you want to explore a group dynamic to understand broader topics or for generating new ideas. So it is quite a good way for people to feed off each other. They often feel comfortable sort of in that situation where they're with people who have the same condition and they can relate to each other. And often that leads to a really great group discussion. And finally, cognitive interviews. That's when we're using a mixed methods approach. So we commonly conduct qualitative research before we move on to a quantitative stage. And we want to test our survey to make sure that it's being understood in the way that's intended. So we conduct the cognitive interviews, usually about 3 or 4. And that's where the researcher will actually interview the participant as they complete the online survey. So it's almost a think aloud exercise as they work through the survey. And that just allows us to make sure that the survey is being understood in the way intended. It allows us to adjust anything to improve it before we launch to a broader sample. And then just briefly, in terms of how we go about analysing qual. We always collect transcripts of our interviews and focus groups, and that is quite a lot of information, because you can imagine even one depth interview is an hour in duration. So we work through the transcripts and do an extensive review of the data, and that leads us to identify and interpret key themes that are coming through. We already have an idea of the themes because we've based the design of our discussion guide around the objectives of our research partners. So, but often we're looking for new insights as well. And we have an analysis software, qualitative analysis software called NVivo, which we use to help develop a code frame that incorporates similarities and differences in participant views, experiences, and values. So how do we use qualitative research? It can be used as standalone studies or part of the mixed methods approach, which I mentioned earlier. And depending on our research objectives, we can conduct a full qualitative component. And that's really useful in therapeutic areas where there's limited research available, so particularly in rare disease. And then that really allows us to go into depth, to delve into the impact of the condition from a holistic point of view, where we not only explore sort of the physical impact in terms of side effects and symptoms, but also the emotional, social, and financial impacts of living with a particular condition. We will also explore the impact on families, carers, and as Cathy mentioned at the start, a lot of our research is looking at treatment preferences. So it allows us to really explore the experiences that people have had with treatment. So previous, current, and also any new treatment on the market. We conduct smaller qualitative components when we already have quite a lot of knowledge, or we've previously conducted research, or there is sufficient existing information. And as I mentioned, it's to help design the next stage of research, which is the quantitative stage, testing the content and the language for inclusion in the online survey. And once again, the cognitive interviews are conducted prior to the quantitative stage, just so we can make any final adjustments prior to launching that survey. So just now looking at the outcomes of QUAL, we really recommend and conduct qualitative research for a large proportion of our research studies, because it really provides that first-hand feedback of what it's like to live with a condition. So it's talking to people who have lived with a condition and really understanding what they've gone through. And this raises awareness of what's important to people. And you can raise this awareness among healthcare professionals, so that can then assist in treatment decision making. And you can raise awareness within the wider community. So as Anne mentioned, it can support health technology assessment decisions, whether it's PBAC or MSAC or funding decisions. And in the last 6 months, we've actually conducted 2 standalone key qualitative projects that have been specifically for that intention of a PBAC and MSAC submission. And what's really useful is following analysis, we put together a really detailed report where we incorporate a lot of patient quotes to illustrate exactly what patients are saying across all the objectives of all the areas, topics that we've covered in the research. And they're really powerful when it comes to understanding from the patient's own words what they've been going through and their opinions about things. I've conducted a lot of qualitative research, but there are some sort of comments that people have told me that just stick in my mind. A few years ago, I was conducting research into melanoma, and I was talking to a young father. He would have been in his early 40s, and he had a couple of really young children, and we were talking about reimbursement, obtaining the new products through PBS listing. And he told me that if they were not reimbursed and the impact that this would have on him and his family, his words were, "I would build a box and get in it." So that really shows that implication of not having access to treatment under the PBS and the difficulties people would have to access such treatment. There was another, I was interviewing parents of children who have cancer, and I was talking to one mum and asking her how she had found navigating the healthcare system in advocating for her child. And she had just told me all about the difficulties she'd encountered, and she described navigating the healthcare system as a web of SHIT. And that was really then demonstrating how difficult she had found that. So all these sort of illustrations of real experiences that people go through are powerful in terms of generate patient-based evidence. And leading on to that, that type of information can help assist in implementing programs and interventions to improve the healthcare journey. So identifying gaps in care and treatment where people themselves can make recommendations on improvements. And from patient organisation perspectives, it can possibly help understand the key elements that are important to your members. So how satisfied people are with your services, are there any gaps, can any improvements be made? And so just to finish up with the importance of qualitative research in sort of hearing from patients themselves, also generating new insights. And if you're doing a mixed methods approach, mapping out the next stage of research. And if you are thinking about submitting a research paper, it does add credibility to that as well. So now I would like to introduce Clare from the Mito Foundation. And I just thought that I would sort of start by asking Clare a little bit about her role at Mito and what actually mitochondrial disease is. But I will stop sharing because I think that Clare has some slides to share as well.
Thanks,
Cathy. Yeah. Clare, are you?
Yep, all good.
Oh, excellent.
Hi, Claire. Hi, Jenny. So I think it's probably worth explaining what Mito is. Like many rare diseases, not many people understand it. So We use the term Mito to refer to primary mitochondrial disease, which is a group of rare and ultra rare conditions. Basically, a genetic change will cause mitochondrial dysfunction. So it's an umbrella term, similar to cancer. Depending on your definition, some people say there's around 400 different types of mito, but there's about 20 different sort of clinical syndromes that people associate with as a diagnosis. We often say that Mito can cause any symptom in any organ at any age, which is helpful to get the attention of GPs. But it is a little bit based in fact, in the sense that there's some common symptoms like muscle weakness and fatigue, epilepsy, stroke-like episodes, vision and hearing loss, but can also lead to things like gastrointestinal problems, cardiac symptoms, liver, kidneys. There's a whole lot of things that can happen. So for some people, it results in really early death in life. So some families, bereaved families that go through really awful trauma, often with multiple children, but then other people live with more of a chronic illness and maybe slow progression. So a lot of diversity there. We think there's about 4,500 Australians currently living with Mito, and we did some work published last year, gosh, a lot of time's gone past, where we worked with health economists to estimate that if you look through an economic lens, we think Mito costs Australia about $1 billion each year, mostly due to early death and reduced quality of life. So that's Mito in a nutshell. My current role is policy and advocacy manager at Mito Foundation. So I'm sort of responsible for all our work to influence others to join our work in finding treatments and cures for Mito and ensuring the best possible services and supports, particularly in healthcare, for Australians living with Mito. And I think Cathy read my LinkedIn bio, so that gives you a little bit of extra background on me. But I am coming to you today from regional New South Wales on the lands of the Wiradjuri people in Orange, if you've ever visited or drunk our beautiful wine.
Thank you so much. So I know that you've used qualitative research at your organisation, and I'd love to hear a little bit about the reasons you conducted qual and how you went about it.
Yeah, absolutely. The first project I did at Mito Foundation that used qualitative methods was around HTA, and so far that's the only HTA involvement Mito Foundation's had, but I would like to share some ways that we're using qual research outside of HTA as well, because I think from a patient organisation perspective, it does go broader. But with our HTA example, we wanted to submit in support of Medicare funding for genetic testing for Mito. And I think there's still a webinar recording somewhere in the Patient Voice Initiative's great resources. Anne is nodding if you wanted to find out more about the context for this decision and our thinking. But effectively, we really wanted MSAC, the committee that makes decisions about what is funded on Medicare, or I should say makes recommendations. We wanted them to understand Mito and make a well-informed decision about whether or not it met the criteria for being funded through Medicare.
Excellent. So you decided to do qual. What did you actually do, and what were the outcomes?
Yeah, sure. So it was our first foray as an organisation into this process, as I mentioned. We got some really good help from the Consumer Evidence and Engagement Unit to really understand what our points of influence would be. And we had a pretty good understanding. We'd seen the submission that was made by some Mito clinicians, and we could see what they had highlighted to MSAC. We really wanted to influence the PICO, which particularly the O part of a PICO. I won't go into too much detail, but hopefully that whets your appetite to learn more about it. So the O stands for outcomes. So this is, what would actually be achieved by having greater access to genetic testing. So we wanted to build on the formal evidence that did exist in publications. Particularly, there were 2 large Australian studies that had sought genetic diagnosis for groups of people with the symptoms of Mito. And they'd compared that to other ways of diagnosing Mito. We also wanted to add to what clinicians were providing, including in the submission, but also from other clinicians that we knew that were going to be part of this process, their description of the current pathways versus the reality of what was happening for people living with Mito, we knew was not necessarily consistent, and we wanted to make sure that MSAC had the right information. So we didn't really have the time to do a formal study. We knew that the diversity of the Mito community, which I touched on earlier, means that telling their stories was the appropriate way to do that. I liked Anne's separation of, participation and research, but I think our work kind of straddled both of them. And I think we're moving more towards research as a distinct aspect. But essentially, I interviewed about 8 community members from memory, and really sought to illustrate our existing position with quotes from those community members.
Yeah.
So reflecting on it now, it's really hard to not be critical because we've learned a lot since then, but we really didn't go out with open questions of, what is diagnosis like today, and really discovering things. We were really doing sort of maybe quote collection more than sort of more basic trying to answer research questions. So for example, I asked community members who didn't yet have a genetic diagnosis what it would mean to them to have a genetic diagnosis. Or for those that did have a genetic diagnosis, I asked them to reflect on how things have changed for them since getting that. So that was really about, we were trying to understand their views on things, but it was probably done in a fairly, confirmation biased kind of way. I think, Jenni, you also asked about what we did with the results. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so we made 2 submissions to MSAC in their process. We had 2 opportunities. The first was about a 15-page written submission, just took the form of a letter, which was essentially putting forward our point of view as an organisation and illustrating that with quotes from community to really make it come to life. I haven't done a word count, but I reckon might have been 60% words in the quotes and 40% sort of words from us to explain our point of view. But just to illustrate that, I did pull out a couple of quotes. Hopefully my slideshow works. So in our submission, we really, as I said, one of the things we focused on was what were the outcomes that we wanted the MSAC process to consider. I'm not expecting everyone to read all of that really quickly, so just go with me here. The ones that I've put in bold are the ones that we really felt that the existing evidence didn't really capture the full extent of, and that voices from the community would make a difference. So particularly for the first and the second one, there's a couple of quotes that I thought I'd highlight to give people the gist of how we were able to use qualitative data to explain this better. So around reducing duration, burden, cost, and emotional strain, like what does that actually look like for people? It wasn't well documented, certainly not in Australia, as to what that looks like. There's an American study that sort of did quantitative data of, yes, it takes 3 years on average, but that's on average. Some people it's diagnosed on their first acute episode, and some people they're in the diagnostic odyssey for 20 years, and no one had captured what was that actually like for people. And the complex and risky clinical tests was another one that we actually a little bit unexpectedly heard a lot more about than we expected. So I can go to the next one. So this was a quote I collected from someone who lives with Mito, but they were talking much more about what they heard from other community members that they supported. So they were particularly motivated by the story of a man who's had so many different clinical tests, including muscle biopsies, which are a pretty awful thing if you've been through that. Exercise stress tests for someone that has muscle fatigue and weakness. Huge emotional and physical stress caused by going through all of that. So maybe it wouldn't have been avoided. We have a yield of about 60%. But if you think of 100 people going through this, if we can get 60 of them to experience a diagnosis with only a blood test, that would be incredible. And then another quote that gives you a flavour of this is, what is this mental health impact of all this clinical testing? Usually it's a process of elimination. Let's look for all of the common diseases before we end up with, well, in the absence of anything else, it must be Mito. That dreading the next test result, this never-ending process of elimination. So we try to use that qualitative data to actually illustrate what that meant.
Great. So I guess what have been the overall benefits to Mito patients as a result of this qualitative research you've conducted?
Yeah, absolutely. So the good news story is that did lead to a positive recommendation from MSAC, which about a year later led to implementation, which was in late 2023. So we now have genetic testing for Mito listed on the MBS. The ripple effects of that are that we think it's added a bit of validity to this this set of diseases called Mito. We know that many health professionals weren't educated about Mito. It was only really described in the 1980s. It's relatively new on the scene. So actually having it listed in Medicare not only removes a potential financial barrier to testing, but we think it's having ripple effects in people believing that Mito is actually a thing, and having a list of symptoms in the definition of a test, we think is having a ripple effect. Helped us to sort of have a reason to talk to a wider group of health professionals about Mito. And we've also had feedback from community that they really valued being seen by government in this particular way. But the unexpected benefit that I think relates to this topic today is just the feedback we got from community members, and this is one eloquent response. So we got a few totally unsolicited when we said, hey, this is our submission. Thank you to everyone that took part. People really valued being seen and bringing those perspectives together. And this quote and this sentiment was something that then motivated our kind of subsequent work since then in qualitative research, and thinking differently about, you know, whether this was just about supporting one HTA submission.
And Claire, were there any challenges that you encountered doing this research?
Absolutely. And that's what I mean when I said describe how we did it. And I look back on it now and I go, oh, it wasn't great. Look, the main thing for me reflecting on that process was that interviewing community members for a single project was not a good use of everyone's resources. Most importantly, their resources, including time and energy, and for some people, you know, the emotional tax or trauma of retelling some pretty awful stories about their diagnostic odyssey, to just use the story for one goal. Now, it was a really great goal, but to use it for just one goal, reflecting on it, it really didn't feel great. So we really wanted to share data and insights more widely, but we hadn't really done the work to enable something like publication, which I think you and Anne have both touched on. We didn't have a clear methodology. We didn't really describe our research questions up front, and we didn't really take a kind of structured approach to recruitment, data collection, or analysis. So reflecting on it, we didn't love those aspects. It had a whole lot of other limitations, including diversity, as I think Anne mentioned. We're pretty typical. We've got a bias towards middle-aged white females in, you know, medium to high socioeconomic sort of settings. So that was predominantly who we talked to. Very opportunistic sampling, as they would say.
Thank you. And Cathy, if I've got time, one last question. Claire, how do you plan to use qual in the future?
I made a pretty slide, which was really good reflective practice for me, but this is summarising where Mito Foundation's at. So since the Medicare submission, we have made some progress on what is the use of qualitative research across all of our work. So I just came up with these terms this morning. You can tell me if you think they make sense to you, because they kind of appear inside my brain as to how I think about it. I really think about this MSAC HTA example as kind of an ad hoc approach. Let's just make it up. We've got a short time frame. Let's go for it. Do what we can do. And it's not a failure. You know, there wasn't harm caused to people. It achieved the outcome, as far as we know. Not that you get feedback from HTA processes, but that's another whole conversation. We then went on and did two projects that I'm quite proud of. One that was a little bit more of a mixed result, where we sat down more purposely and said, well, what are these topics that we really don't know enough about in order to help solve problems? And we really then articulated research questions. We created really solid interview guides, and we have self-published results from that. And they've both had reasonably big impacts in our opinion. So one was about the community's expectations of mitochondrial donation, which is a new IVF-based prevention technology that we're working with researchers on. And the second was around people's experience with dietary supplements. So with that, we increased the number of people we talked to, and we really took a much more structured thematic analysis approach to how we wrote up those results. And they're all available. If you can't find them in the public domain, please send me an email and I will send you to them. So they were really good. But then we reflected on that and said, look, we can't keep collecting these amazing experiences from people and not look at how it affects us, our work, and how we can share it with others for a bigger impact. So where we're at right now is, I'm calling, I don't know, capability level 3, having an ongoing capability. So we're now, you know, being a little bit more fancy. We now have HREC, I shouldn't say a little bit, substantially more sophisticated. We now have HREC approval for the work that we're doing under a project we call the Mito Stories project. We're trying to collect people's experiences on particular themes and build that over time for multiple purposes. We're using software like NVivo to really create this database of stories. And the idea is that when we do get that next HTA review, HTA opportunity, or like the work we're doing with trying to influence some things happening within the National Disability Insurance Agency at the moment, we're able to pull out those stories more quickly and more readily. Yes, we could add to them, but we're reusing the amazing contributions communities made already. And that's involved a whole lot of investment, and I know that's out of reach for lots of people, but I'm really happy to talk to people about what we've learned along the way, because I think there's some interesting findings that people can use in lots of, smaller projects.
Does
Thank
sound
you
like
so
you've learned
much.
a lot.
Yes,
Thank
and
you,
I love
Claire.
that last slide, and I think the terminology is perfect. I'd really like to thank you, Jenni and Claire, for your insights. Really, really valuable, and bringing qualitative research to life with that example. There was a question that came through for you, Claire. Have you considered how you reach opinions from those outside the middle class age white female cohort? Have you come up with some solution for that?
Yeah, based on some conversations we've had over the last couple of years, we think there's quite a few barriers. So one of the barriers is that interaction with us was always previously framed as come to us if you need help for things. And what we found is a lot of people, they didn't need that. And this particularly applies to when we think about for those that identify as male, I'm totally generalizing, they don't tend to want to join a peer group. They don't tend to want to talk to other people with a box of tissues at hand. And that was sort of the historic model and certainly the brand perception. So by pitching this Mito Stories project as a separate research project, we're seeing more people respond to us and say, look, I'm willing to help others. I don't need anything. I'm good, but I'm willing to contribute my story if it'll help others. That's the only one of our things that we have actually implemented yet. So for those classic kind of priority population, really tricky aspects of diversity, very much a work in progress. We do have a clinical fellow that we happen to be funding next year that comes from an Arabic-speaking background. And so we've given some of the slightly higher prevalence in particularly Lebanese Australian communities. We're starting that process of improving our own cultural competency by working with that clinical fellow and some of the health services, particularly in southwestern Sydney, to really improve our reach as an organisation. So I don't have any easy answers, but we do have it on our radar, and we're trying to figure out what the right answer is. The other thing on my wish list is trying to recruit to work like this through our clinical services for mitochondrial disease, but only through having HREC approval and really doing this as a formal project. Did we think we were going to really get clinicians across the line that they would start recruiting or help passing on those recruitment invitations to their patients, which we believe would be a kind of more diverse set of people.
Wonderful, Claire. Really thank you for bringing that to life. And Anne has put in the chat, we're very good at acronyms. So the HREC is the Human Research Ethics Committee, and PBAC, MSAC and HTA. So if you need a reference when acronyms are being flown around, please have a look in the chat. There's a comment there about great critical limitations reflection, Claire, for secondary use to maximise capture experience at a certain time point, dated a database, which is exactly right. And I think what I loved hearing your story come to life, Claire, is that you started with a clear why for when you first did the qualitative research. It was for a purpose around MSAC, and then you've thought, well, hold on, how can we build that, and through capabilities. So it is, I think, important to say it doesn't always have to start at that really top-end, high-quality qualitative research. It's having a real clear why and then bringing that purpose to life and learning from that experience. So thank you so much to you and Jenni. That was really valuable. Before we go to the break, I just want to pause to see if there's any questions before we just have a 10-minute. Maybe we might make it 5-minute if that's okay, because we've got some brilliant speakers ready to go. So any last minute questions? There is one, I think, that came through. Where do you source funding for things like HREC approval, analytics software, etc.? That was a question, Claire.
It is the elephant in the room, and I often feel a sense of guilt. The reason I work at Mito Foundation is we happen to be big enough to fund this sort of work at the moment. I'm knocking on my wooden desk. We have a series of fundraising walks called Bloody Long Walk, which gives us a large amount of untied revenue. The campaign we did to legislate for mitochondrial donation in Australia, I think really bolstered our confidence to invest in advocacy. And I think it's only off the back of that momentum that I've been able to use our internal untied funds to really do this work. It's a pilot piece of work, and we're rapidly coming up to the end of that to say, what is the future? I haven't actually even crunched the numbers of what we're actually going to be spending on this first approach. And we've started trying to submit philanthropic sort of trusts and foundations to try and really get that. At the moment, we're framing it as, you know, this is a foundation and that it has to be done in order to support all of our work. But yeah, I don't have a long-term plan. But that's because I work in an NGO that doesn't have sustainable funding like most people on this call. So sorry, Penelope, I don't have a magical solution. But if you've ever heard of Bloody Long Walk, you should keep supporting people and think about joining the walk, because that's the only answer I have to your question.
Perfect. Well, that is a brilliant place to just pause for 5 minutes. So it's 12:07, or depending on where you are, at 7 past the hour. So if we can come back maybe at 15 past the hour. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had time to grab a cuppa. And whilst everyone is rejoining again, I would like to reintroduce Anne Single, who will be leading this conversation, and introduce to you Sarah J, because our session today is around how do we better include different communities, for example, with cognitive impairment, into research. So Sarah J is joining the conversation, who is the Consumer Engagement Coordinator for Research at Dementia Australia. In her role, she supports people with a lived experience of dementia to be involved in research projects, liaises with the researchers, and builds capacity for meaningful engagement of people with a lived experience of dementia in research. Previously, Sarah worked as a researcher where her PhD and the work that followed focused on understanding the impact of shift work for sleep, health, safety, and well-being. So welcome, Sarah, and I will hand to Anne to lead this discussion.
Thanks, Cathy.
Oh, thanks, Cathy. And hi, Sarah. It's been really nice to meet you. One of the nice things about organising these workshops is we get to make new connections. And so it's been great to find out about your role. Now, Cathy just gave us the formal description of your role. Can you just put that into everyday language and tell us a bit about what you do?
Yes, certainly. Thanks again for having me. So, as Cathy said, my role is in the consumer engagement team here at Dementia Australia, and specifically I am the consumer engagement coordinator for research. So I'm part of a broader team, and the broad goal of the team is to support the Dementia Advocates Network. So the Dementia Advocates Network is a network of people with a lived experience of dementia. So people living with dementia, carers or former carers that voluntarily join the network. And there's several hundred dementia advocates, as we call them, across Australia. And as a team, we support them to do all sorts of advocacy work, both for Dementia Australia, but also for external stakeholders and communities as well. But anything research related comes to me. And so I support dementia advocates to be involved in research by letting them know about opportunities and helping them with their roles in research. And I also support researchers who get in contact with us about their projects and how and the different ways that they might want to involve people with a lived experience of dementia in their work.
Oh, it sounds fascinating. So what sort of research projects have people living with dementia been involved with researchers with?
So I guess any type of dementia-related research, I probably have got an example of a dementia advocate, probably specifically a person living with dementia that's been involved in some way or form. And so from anything from basic or discovery lab-based science all the way through to more translation type research, there's roles for people with a lived experience and for people who have dementia or mild cognitive impairment as well. So the roles might look different, and at the points at which people or researchers might involve people living with dementia in their work will vary depending on their experience, their budget, the stage of the project, the type of project. But in essence, there's ways for people to be involved every step of the way.
Okay, so my understanding, and some of this is from your very useful website, is that dementia varies and that behind the term there are more than 100 conditions. But I understand that it commonly impacts on people's communication and focus and memory. And then this may be something that I think other patient communities may have some similar symptoms or some experiences, and so I wondered whether you could give some tips or share some ideas about improving research processes so that people who have difficulty communicating or focusing or remembering information can partner in it.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I'm always pleased to talk about something like this because I think what people are after more often than not, particularly researchers, is practical tips about how they can do it. And I guess for people living with dementia, you're right, and that there are many different types of dementia. And something that we always say here at Dementia Australia is that if you know one person living with dementia, then you know one person living with dementia. People's experiences are really varied based on a whole range of factors. And so my main bit of advice for researchers or people wanting to involve people living with dementia or other kinds of cognitive impairment in their work is to take time to get to know the individual as a person and not to make assumptions about what you think they might want or need, but instead take time to foster a genuine sort of relationship. It doesn't have to be a really personal relationship, but a genuine working relationship, so that you can get to know them as a person and find out the best ways that you can support them so they can be involved to the best of their ability. So, for example, a person living with dementia, I can think of a dementia advocate that I know well, and she, for example, really does not do well with being given questions on the spot. So if she's going to be involved as part of a meeting, if she's on an advisory group or a steering committee or part of a phone call, she really appreciates having a clear agenda of where the call or the meeting is going to go. If there's going to be questions asked, she likes to have them in advance, even down to if you're going to do a brief at the beginning of a meeting, let's go around the room and introduce yourself and say a little bit about yourself. She, for example, and others would really appreciate just knowing that that's going to happen so she can prepare something, because that's how she likes to work and that's how she's most comfortable. So making the time to know how you can better support someone. Another example might be if people are going to be involved in bigger meetings where there's lots of other stakeholders, like a steering committee or an advisory group, to perhaps offer them a pre-meeting the day before or even a few hours before to go through the agenda, how it's going to work, who might be there, what their thoughts are on the different agenda items, so that when it comes to the meeting, they've had a chance to consolidate their thoughts, but then also you might be able to act as a prompt if you know that they have something to contribute to the meeting or on a particular point, because you've already gone through it. An opportunity also after a larger meeting like that to debrief, just perhaps you and or the researcher or a smaller group, to give them an opportunity to say things that perhaps they couldn't quite articulate in the meeting, or thoughts that have come to them afterwards, is also a really neat way to make sure that you capture all their thoughts and their value, without having it to be concentrated in a 1 hour meeting requiring them to put up their hand and be confident to speak in front of everyone. So there's some practical examples. I could go on. I don't know if we've got time, but I've got lots of other things, like making sure you speak in plain English. You can explain the work or the research or the role really clearly. Don't make assumptions about people being confident on Zoom. That doesn't mean they can't use it, but offering support or a practice if that's what's required. And I guess, yeah, basically getting to know the person, just being really open about getting them to talk about what might be helpful for them.
Oh, that's really useful. I'm sure people will have more questions too. I'm just going to sneak one more question in, which is, I'm thinking about those at the most advanced stages of dementia.
Yeah.
Are there ways that researchers can learn about their needs and experiences or their quality of life to improve their care?
Yeah. So when I'm talking about people living with dementia who've been involved in research projects, I'm speaking about advocates that, well, in my experience, all advocates who are living out in the community, usually living really well with dementia, with varying levels of support. But obviously, as dementia progresses, advocates become less able to be involved in research and other advocacy work. But that doesn't mean that there aren't still ways to involve them or their experiences in your work or your research. And so the main way, I guess, would be to make sure that you're including the voices of current carers in particular, or former carers, people that are involved in caring for someone in the more advanced stages of dementia at the moment, so that they can relay their thoughts and experiences to you. And I guess just being really open to including people where there's a willingness for them to want to be included.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. And some of the things, when we were preparing this call, that I found really helpful was some suggestions that I think can even be useful for people who have sort of a mental fog with conditions that might come and go a bit, and some broader conditions. And that's not to say that they're the same, because I think one of the things you've really stressed there is not to assume the person we know is everyone, and getting to know those people and to talk and to work out what will be the best way to include. I'm just having a look to see if there's any questions for you. And of course, you can pop questions in the chat anytime. I often think of them as the day goes on, and we welcome those as well. Sarah, are you going to be able to hang around a bit, or are you needing to pop off?
No, I can hang around for a little bit. Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So if you're thinking about something, or you're just forming a question for Sarah, she'll be here for a bit longer. And so thank you so much, Sarah. It was great to get an insight into this briefly today. And I'll hand back to Cathy.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate what Anne said. Thank you so much, Sarah. And I think it's a really important, because we had a discussion with Clare and the Mito Foundation, and around that diversity and inclusion of all parts of our community. So that was some really helpful, practical tips that you've shared. So thank you so much for that. And yes, I'm really enjoying the chat. I think Chris had some thoughts after the last one, and Claire's responded. So please pop them in the chat, and we'll keep a monitoring of that. So we'll switch gears, and now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our next two speakers for our last part of the formal presentation pieces, and then we're going to make sure there's time for any questions, comments, and before Anne closes, and we'll keep to time at 1 o'clock. So I'd like to introduce Simon Fifer. Dr. Simon Fifer is the Director of Research and Innovation at CaPPRe, the Community and Patient Preference Research Organisation. He's also on the advisory committee at the Patient Voice Initiative. He specialises in studying human decision-making using choice-based measurement techniques, with a particular focus on understanding patient preferences in healthcare settings. And Simon's also on the editorial board for the journal The Patient, and co-chairs the Patient Preference Project Subcommittee, another acronym, PPPS, part of HTAI, the international arm of the Health Technology Assessment Patient and Citizen involvement group. And the current focus of the committee is on the integration of patient preference in HTA processes. And Simon has a PhD in choice modelling from the University of Sydney. So I think he is well versed to talk to us about patient preferences today. And he will later be joined as bringing this to life through an experience with an organisation by Brent Clifton. So we're thrilled to welcome Brent as well, who's the Deputy Director at NAPWHA, which is the National Association of People with HIV Australia. And Brent is a motivated and passionate leader in the community health sector with more than 11 years of professional experience supporting people with HIV locally, nationally and internationally. So I will now hand to Simon and Brent for this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Cathy. Thanks, everyone. Can you just let me know if you can see the screen there? Oh, good. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about patient preferences. I'm going to take you through some examples and then hand over to Brent to talk about a case study that we worked on together in terms of CaPPRe and NAPWHA. There may be questions that come up, and yeah, feel free to drop them in the chat, and Anne or Cathy will bring them up, or we can talk about them at the end. So when we're talking about patient preferences and the methods, what are we talking about? So it is really, this is a stylized example. It is really about how do people make decisions, trying to identify from patients, consumers, in a healthcare setting, what's important to them when they're making decisions. And one of those key questions that we pose up the top is, do benefits outweigh risks and costs? And you can see on this little balance diagram here, on the one end, we might have risks and costs like side effects, out-of-pocket costs. On the other end, we might have benefits like efficacy. That may mean lots of different things. In the Alzheimer's or dementia space, it might be slowing down progression. In the cancer oncology space, it might be progression-free survival, or lots of other things, improving quality of life. And then there's these things in the middle that from a HTA point of view, they're often called non-health factors, but they all weigh into people's decisions. Things like, how often do I have to have this treatment? So frequency. How do I have the treatment? How is it administered? Do I have to go into a clinic and have an IV infusion for a couple of hours? Do I take an oral pill? These are the types of things that are important to people, and we measure in preferences. So how do they work? And you can see, and I'm not going to go into too many acronyms. I'm trying to avoid them. You heard in the title, there were lots of them. But one of the key methods we use is called the discrete choice experiment, but we're going to call that DCE for short. So if you ever see that linked to preferences, just remember it's a type of experiment that we use in preferences. Now, what we're trying to do here is give people scenarios where they can make choices. So they use their own value, their own framework, what's important to them, and they make choices based on these scenarios that we present to people. So you can see in this quick example I have two different scenarios. They're described by features, administration, frequency, and cost. Now, between those two scenarios, they change. They're different in terms of how the different alternatives, an A and B in this particular case, are described. Now, what we do in these experiments is ask people to make choices. That's all you really have to do, is look at it, evaluate it, and make a choice. Once we observe your choice, we're able to work out what you value. So the methods don't have to ask you to rate things, rank things, like some other survey methods do. We just observe you making a choice. And over repeated choices, and in most situations, it might be something like 8 to 10 of these choices, we're able to work out what you value and what others value. So a real quick example now. If I just gave this to you, and you don't really need to know the context, just think about if you were considering between these two options, by a treatment mode, a frequency, side effects, and improvement in quality of life, between an A and a B option, what would you choose? Just have a quick think about what you would do in this situation. I'll give you a couple more seconds. And this is example 1. Now jumping to example 2. The attributes or the features have stayed the same, but what we describe these options have changed. They're what we call levels, and they've changed in example 2 compared to 1. So what would you choose now between A and B? And you can start to see how am I processing this information? How am I thinking? What are my eyes going to? What are the key things that are important to me when I'm making this decision? So if you've made another choice, last 1, 3. Things have changed again. And so once again, how have the things changed? Am I still sticking with A or am I moving to B? That's the type of choice or preference scenarios that we present to people in these types of experiments. So that was just a real quick example of 3 different things, just to get you thinking what it would be like as a participant of these types of studies. What does it feel like to make these choices? How are you reviewing the information, and what are you doing as you go through these different screens? So why do we use them? So we use them to enhance evidence for lots of different things. HTA is one of them, and I'm going to focus on that today. But we use preference studies for lots of different areas. But in a HTA point of view, we're trying to establish a value framework from a patient lens. So what is important to patients or carers or someone else, but particularly from a patient point of view? And sticking with that HTA framework, we are looking at comparing treatments. So when you're submitting to a HTA or there's a submission, it's looking at something, what's the current standard of care? What's happening now versus what this new treatment or new intervention might do? And how do they compare based on what patients value? That's the important thing that these preference studies add that is missing from the other parts of the evidence. So Anne talked about other parts like clinical evidence, cost effectiveness. What about the patient values? What about how they think about things? That's not covered here. That's what we're trying to do when we do a preference study, and what it adds as evidence, and it fits under that patient-based evidence umbrella term. What it adds is patient-based evidence to a HTA submission. What are the steps when you're conducting a preference study? So it is a long process, and we can talk about that in more detail. These types of studies might take between 8 and 12 months. That's why they do require some forward planning. So the difference between obviously patient input and patient-based evidence is it does often require a little bit more forward planning in terms of what are we trying to show? What are the objectives of this research? And we might need to do it maybe 12 months prior to a HTA submission. We do interviews with people, as Jenni and Clare outlined. Speaking with people at the start is where we start always, in trying to actually understand what's happening for people living with the condition. We then take that information alongside other things like literature reviews into a workshop with people with lived experience, with carers, with patients, with doctors, with researchers, and actually think, well, how do we actually design these types of scenarios similar to the ones that you saw? What would they look like? What's the wording that we would use? We then put it into a design. That's where the experiment part comes into the word DCE. It is an experiment. We create these surveys with these scenarios in point 4. We collect the data. There's lots of different ways we do collect the data. A lot of it is online, but it doesn't have to be. You could do face-to-face as well. You could do paper-based is what we used to use as well. But there's lots of different ways on a tablet, on an iPad. We can collect it using any of these types of ways. And do these show, but these are the results. And we'll talk about that in the next slides. And then interpreting those results and making them come to life. And actually then sharing them with stakeholders. What does it mean? What do we get out of this? As a patient organization, sharing with your stakeholders, giving it to doctors, putting it on social media, giving it to a HTA committee. How do we present these results and what do we get from them? These are some of the things that we can measure in terms of outputs. And while I go through these, just have a think, do any of these align with research questions that you have or that you've thought about that you would like to do? So things like relative attribute importance. So what matters most to patients? Very general, but it's probably at a top level what we start with when it comes to a preference study. Trade-offs, benefits versus risks. What do people value when they're making decisions in this context? You can take that down to another way of looking at it, which is maximum acceptable risk, which is how much increase in risk would I tolerate for a particular benefit? So, for example, increase in side effects for an added year of survival. What would I tolerate? These are the types of trade-offs you can look at. And when you're giving the information to a committee, they can look at, well, maybe people are not as concerned with the side effects. Maybe they're interested really in the benefit. And not all people are the same. So they're going to have different weights or different preferences, but that's some of the things that you can tease out. Non-health benefits I talked about before, changing in the frequency, changing in the way the treatment is delivered, an IV, an injection versus an oral. That's something that you can evaluate and weigh up using preferences. When a new treatment comes into our country, for example, how many people would use it? You can actually take these models and predict uptake or demand. And once again, what segments of people would use it? Is this really suitable for this group, but not for another group? And why is that? Why is it that one group prefer it over another? You can look into those questions. There are things like willingness to pay you can look at if you want to have a cost variable, so you can bring in willingness to pay. That's not always the case. That's just something extra that may come out of the particular study. In terms of evaluating the clinical, which you often see is not done, is endpoint prioritization. So when you're looking at clinical data, you see these endpoints, like what were we measuring in this study to show that this treatment works? And they might be primary, secondary endpoints. What does the patient think about those things? How do they evaluate endpoints? Often that's not done. And then when it goes to these committees, they don't know what patients think about these values, these endpoints, and what does it mean to them. It's a really important part, and it'd be great to see preferences done in all clinical trials, but unfortunately that is not the case. But interpreting the trial results through the lens of a patient should be done every time, but unfortunately it's not. And segmentation, which I've already talked about, is different people having different preferences and trying to understand that. And particularly relevant for people making decisions for those people is they don't know that answer unless they've done a study like this, in that they're just thinking all people are the same. If you don't know how people are different in what they value, then how are you going to look at how this is going to benefit this particular group or other groups of people? The way they work is essentially you evaluate these different components. So like an administration or a frequency or cost, you break them up into little features and you evaluate each feature independently. And then you essentially sum them up. You sum them up to get an overall score. And once you have this model that gives you the score, you can put any treatment or any intervention into that model. So something that's coming out now, something that might come out in 3 years. How do they score against a patient value scoring mechanism? That's essentially what these models are doing. And then those scores, which are based on weights, once again, how do they vary by people, which is called heterogeneity or variation in preferences. And that's some of the key things that we can get out of these preference studies. I talked about some of these outputs before, so attribute and level importance and uptake. So you can get a full hierarchy of those features. So did progression-free survival completely dominate for people? How do they trade? What's the next most important thing? Is it severe side effects? Is it cost? Is it the way that you take the treatment? You get a hierarchy to show is something twice as more important than something else, and you can evaluate that. And uptake, as I said, is something else we can look at, is how many people would actually prefer one treatment versus another in a particular market. We put these into interactive dashboards for stakeholders so they can actually see this come to life. The model itself is a little bit boring. It has, if you've read any papers, you would understand that models can be a little bit boring. But actually taking the model and making it interactive is where it becomes really interesting. Because in this particular example, you can see I still have an A and B comparison. But now I'm looking at taking that attribute importance, that model, and then trying to see, well, what if a treatment had better efficacy? What if it enabled you to actually have progression-free survival of an extra 6 months versus the other treatment? What if it had better side effects? What if it was an oral and we didn't have an oral in the market already? What would that do? How many people would actually want to use that treatment? Then you can look at these preference shares, which are just shown here. So I can change any scenario using this particular dashboard and actually perform all these what-if scenarios, just captured from those little scenarios we presented to people. And then we can actually go, well, how does this compare with the status quo of what people are currently receiving? What about the new treatment that's coming out in 3 years' time? How does that work? So we can actually look at all of these things against a patient value framework. I talked about attribute importance, which is that full list of how people make decisions. Just taking it back to HTA for a moment, this is a nice paper, actually from NICE. If you want to have a look, I've got the reference there, but it just talked about a few years ago how HTA committees were thinking about these studies. They have adapted and changed over the last few years, and our group from PCIG, our subcommittee, that long acronym, we're doing research into this at the moment. We're actually talking with HTA committee members about how and they would like to, or how they do integrate this type of patient evidence into HTA decision making. But this is just an example from NICE that I thought it'd be good to go through a few things that they outlined where they thought there was benefits for this type of evidence. So we talked about non-health. that's a very clear one because the other evidence does not capture this. So HTA committees are saying this would be really helpful to have a quantitative study that actually looks at how these other things valued by patients that we don't know from the clinical and we don't know from cost effectiveness. So one of our key studies that we did at CaPPRe was actually looking at an injection which went from twice a day to once a week. Big change for people's lives, big change in quality of life, big change in adherence, not valued currently within the clinical information. We did a preference study to value it, but that was the only way that you could look at it. So these things are missing. You're missing a whole component of value if you don't understand how these things are traded and how important they are. The other things are when there's lots of different treatment options or multiple options. So things are coming out and they're different and you want to know how people compare them. So different profiles. One has better efficacy, but it has more side effects. One has lower side effects, but the same efficacy. One's a larger cost. One requires you to go for an IV for 6 hours. They're all different. How do they trade across these things? How do we know what people want and what they value? You can use these methods to do that. Variation in people's preferences. This is very important when it comes to even like a country like Australia, is what about where people live? What about different ages? What about regional people versus metro people? What about different experiences? People diagnosed earlier versus later? What about people with better care support networks than others? They're all going to have slightly different preferences. We can capture all of that information about the people and link it to their preferences. But there's so much diversity around. But you need to capture it and then look at, well, why would these people have different preferences? Is it because they live in a regional area? You can try and answer some of those questions by looking at all of that background information you capture within a survey that can be linked to this type of model that you have in the study. New treatments that are coming out, new things that are coming out. There's no other way to actually get the answer to this if you haven't experienced it yet. So these surveys actually present information and you can present hypothetical scenarios. What would people do if they had this situation? So what about a new genomic test that's not out yet? If it gave you this information, how important would that be versus what you currently do? What about CAR-T? What about CAR-T, a new type of treatment that's coming out in the oncology space that you haven't experienced, but if we actually gave you the information, do you think that would be better than what you're currently taking? If it had this efficacy profile, this side effects, it's a very different way of administering treatment. Is that appealing to you? Is it not? If you haven't experienced it yet, this is a way that you can get to that information. That's why sometimes we call these types of methods stated preference methods, because you don't have to have experience with everything in these scenarios. You do capture the current. You definitely have attributes and features that capture what people are currently on, but you also have attributes and features about things that are coming up in a pipeline. And that's why this is particularly helpful for HTA, because the treatments don't have to be in the market yet for you to get valuation of them. Lastly, before I hand over to Brent to talk about the work that we did together in preferences, what about individuals? I've sort of talked about aggregate levels, segments of people. What about an individual? You would expect every individual to have unique preferences. Some would be similar, but not completely the same based on all of the reasons we talked about: experiences, values, perceptions, needs, all of those things coming into play. You can use these models to get individual preferences. We're doing work in this particular space in regards to shared decision-making, because that's where it really comes as a benefit, in the sense that when you're making a decision as a team, as a healthcare team, a patient, a carer, a doctor, a nurse, trying to understand what that individual values is important and may not always come through in the discussions with the healthcare team. So you can use these types of methods to get a valuation for an individual patient, and then actually bring that to the discussion and say, well, actually, looking at my profile for my preferences, I really don't care about side effects. I just want to focus on the treatment that works. Or I am really concerned about side effects. Let's talk about that. Or cost is a big issue for me. Can we have a discussion around that? And it's not about choosing a treatment for you. It is about enhancing the discussion and empowering patients to have the discussion. So the discussion leads to a treatment and outcomes that are aligned with what they value. And that's the important thing. So it's adding to this decision-making context. So that's really all I had. I'm going to hand over to Brent to talk about this further.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm going to take that you can all hear me. I have had a few IT issues this morning, so I got a thumbs up from Anne. Thank you very much. Let me just share some slides before I continue. Are you seeing a whole screen there? Can you see my slides?
Two screens. Two screens.
Just two screens, a paper and the PowerPoint side by side, right?
No problem. Simon, would you mind sharing the slides? I don't think I'm going to have much luck getting this ready.
Sure, I will bring them up now. Won't be a moment.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone. Really interesting webinar thus far. And thank you very much for inviting me along to talk about the project that we did with Simon and the CaPPRe group. Just before I start, I just acknowledge that I'm calling today from the mighty Gadigal land and acknowledge any Indigenous Australians who are on this call today, and pay respects to elders past, present and rising. A little bit about NAPWHA, or the National Association of People with HIV, but NAPWHA will get us through the call a fair bit quicker, with a peak body representing people living with HIV and community organisations who provide tailored support, including treatment information and support to people living with HIV right across Australia. And just an acknowledgement that these slides were prepared by my colleague, Dr. John Rule, who is on annual leave today. But I've had the privilege of working with John and Simon on this project. Thank you. So what was explored in the project? It was key. We wanted to look at key factors and motivators that are important to people living with HIV when selecting their treatment. In Australia, we have long-standing availability of oral antiretroviral therapy, or HIV treatments, which has effectively managed an individual's viral load and has maintained the health of people living with HIV. Oral treatments are effective, well tolerated, and these days have minimal side effects. However, new developments in treatment delivery are emerging, both in Australia and globally. Long-acting antiretroviral therapy, including a 2-monthly option, are currently available, and a 6-monthly injectable is currently in train. And these represent significant advancements in HIV treatment options. Another important piece of context, I think, that kind of underpins the work that we did, is that in Australia we have access to really high quality and the best available oral therapies, often free of charge or at very low cost to the person living with HIV. And we have high uptake of oral therapy in people who've been recently diagnosed, with most people starting on treatments up to 6 weeks after a diagnosis. Almost all people on treatment have an undetectable viral load, which means the treatment works. And in this context, changing treatments, particularly to a new mode like long-acting injectable therapy, and its benefits to individuals, need to be interrogated and better understood by organisations such as NAPWHA. Thank you. So this changing treatment landscape has highlighted key considerations for us regarding whether people living with HIV would prefer an injectable antiretroviral therapy versus their current oral treatments. It raises questions about people's willingness to switch to new yet effective treatments. So we know the 2-monthly injection works. It's been proven in clinical trials, but we needed to kind of interrogate further whether people with HIV perceive benefits of injectables versus oral therapies. And NAPWHA was also reflecting on whether it should support future research and development into drug delivery models, and how these could impact on the further quality of life for people living with HIV. Next slide, please, mate. So the use of a discrete choice experiment, or a DCE, was pretty unfamiliar to John and I when we very first heard the concept, but we recognised it after a bit of looking into it. It was being used in other HIV-related research areas, such as preferences in service delivery. So CaPPRe was engaged by an industry organisation to explore the treatment preferences and worked closely with NAPWHA early to scope the study, develop questions and determine the best target audience for the survey. The study, which included a trial run of the questions, was conducted over a 2-year period and later published in the report that there is a link to on the slide that you have in front of you. Thank you. In-depth qualitative interviews were utilised to identify what mattered to people with HIV, which informed the value mapping exercise that Simon spoke of earlier, which was then used during the quantitative phase of the study. NAPWHA played a key role in recruiting participants, fostering discussion within the organisation and amongst our membership about current interest in this space. And notably, financial supports for NAPWHA's involvement were crucial to ensuring collection of valuable data. The study was successfully recruited up to 120 participants, and I think that highlights the effectiveness of the approach that we took to the study, the DCE, the experiment. Thank you. So and I think it's a recurring theme from some of our speakers here. You know, each guest presenter has spoken on diversity and are we always able to reach everyone within our community that we want to speak to in the studies like this, whether they be qualitative or DCEs. And we came up against the same sorts of issues. Specifically, we're probably underrepresented by women living with HIV, and our groups probably skewed older. So which kind of bears out when you kind of look at the ages of people living with HIV in Australia. But I do think having a look back on the demographics of participants, that was probably an over-representation of people over the age of 40 within our group. Nonetheless, key findings emerged. The majority of study participants, about 2/3, were generally conservative in their treatment decisions and not particularly open to switching to injectable treatments, which was quite surprising. It contrasted with some of the anecdotal community discussions that NAPWHA and our members had been hearing. In particular, that new modes of antiretroviral therapy were sought after within the community. However, there were segments of the population that would be early adopters or were seeking to uptake long-acting injectables for form of HIV treatment. And this highlights the need to better understand that group. The two things that kind of came up, and I can talk through why these are considerable for people living with HIV, cost and side effect risks. They were the two significant factors influencing treatment preferences, which is unsurprising, but validated existing concerns. You will note that I mentioned a little bit earlier that HIV treatment in Australia is free. And that is the case when you dispense the medicine. You can get it at no cost or very low cost. However, to access long-acting therapy, you need to go to 2 monthly clinic visits, which can create a cost burden to a person, particularly if they're not on high income. And we do know that people with HIV are overrepresented in with poverty indicators or low socioeconomic status. Moreover, the risk of side effects are always great for people with HIV. Over the years, our treatments have become very well tolerated, but that does have a long history of side effects within HIV medicine being very toxic and has caused people some ongoing health issues. So unsurprising that those were the two things that came up through the DCE, but also pleasing to kind of have those experiences validated. Last slide, please. So all the data collected was self-reported, again, kind of limiting those groups without internet. And I think this is an ongoing challenge. Simon's mentioned there are alternate ways to kind of collect these data. However, we do really see this quite regularly within a lot of the research that goes on within our sector. However, we did gain valuable insights regarding the patient expectations of clinicians in shared decision-making with healthcare through this study. Notably, 2/3 of participants expressed interest in the change, citing reasons like reduced anxiety related to pill burden, privacy concerns, which is important for NAPWHA and our members to understand and build an evidence base around. The industry company and CaPPRe were instrumental in introducing this new methodology, and it's now up to NAPWHA and our members to promote these study findings while reflecting on both the methods and the outcomes. But all in all, I think it's been a really rich process for us to engage with, certainly a new way for us to engage with community-based research and understanding the preferences of our client group when talking about HIV treatments. That's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon and Brent. I'm really loving the way that we're talking about a concept like patient preferences, and then Brent, you bringing it to life with actually how it was used within an organisation. So thank you so much. We're going to really be strict with time and finish when we said we would. So my only comment is to thank you all for attending. And if we've had a lot of information that's been shared and digested. If there are thoughts afterwards, please don't hesitate to reach out to the PBI CaPPRe team or myself, and we will make sure we direct your questions to you. But I will now hand to Anne to officially close the first session.
And I'll do that once I find my microphone. And just thinking, do put any questions in the chat for Brent. And also, if you want to ask them and you can't get in contact, we can forward questions, because those were such interesting presentations, and I know you'll have questions there. Before we finish, I've got some thank yous to do. Firstly, I want to thank CaPPRe, who's partnered with us. CaPPRe have been with Patient Voice Initiative since before we were Patient Voice Initiative. People like Laurie Axford from CaPPRe are actually our Vice President and our Treasurer. So he makes sure that when we're reimbursing patients for taking part in presenting today, that actually happens, and he keeps us on the straight and narrow there as well. So I want to thank all our speakers today as well. And I hope I don't miss anyone, because we had such a rich package. But thank you to Jenni Godsell from CaPPRe, Clare Stuart from the Mito Foundation. Thank you to Sarah J from Dementia Australia, and of course Simon Fifer from CaPPRe and Brent Clifton from NAPWHA, who we just heard from. Thank you also to Cathy Sertori, who has put this together for us, and just been such a pleasure working with you on this, Cathy. Thank you to our sponsors. Patient Voice Initiative is really delighted that we have these gold sponsors that help us make days like today happen. And also these silver sponsors. So every year we put together our work program and we knock on the door, and we're really delighted that these companies get behind that work program, but also work with us to change the whole environment around how people see patients' knowledge and how they partner with them. So briefly, this is what we're going to pack into next week's session. And I just want to really draw attention to next week. I started off this week by giving us a bit of an overview of patient-based evidence and what was happening globally in HTA. But next week, we're going to bring it right back here to Australia with Jo Watson, who's the Deputy Chair of the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee. And we're going to talk about how this work can be useful there. You'll hear from Simon again with Hayley Beer from Myeloma Australia. Joshi from CaPPRe is going to look at service evaluation. You've got a few more minutes with me around ethical considerations, and also with Cathy talking about seeking funding. And so finally, just to close, I just want to show you there that if you're interested in finding more about how patients can have a voice in health technology assessment, you can check out our hub, you can go to our website, you can send us an email and the lovely Cecily will make sure it gets answered, or you can follow us on Facebook or LinkedIn. Finally, thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope to see you next week.